I think women have arrived in a bit of crisis with regards to any kind of postpartum support. And so I think, especially in this new paradigm that we find ourselves, we really have to navigate and figure out how we can make the best of these kinds of situations, but how we can really look at how important it is to mother the mother, how important it is to recognize the transformation that a woman sort of goes through at this time and give her the support that she really needs. The following is not meant to serve as medical advice. It is merely the story of my own journey and learning process. All the Unexpected, Episode 4, Mothering the Mother. Hello, dear listener. Thank you for joining me for what is now our 4th edition of the All the Unexpected podcast. I've appreciated your emails and your comments on various platforms. It's great to know that as mothers, you can relate to some of what we're saying. I appreciate the feedback, and please continue to let us know what you think about the things that you hear. So, this week's topic, mothering the mother. I had mentioned last week taking a further look at the postpartum experience in relation to the sort of physical aspects that we had talked about last week. I had thought to pivot to a more sort of mental and emotional aspect of it, but as I did some research for this week's episode, I realized I need a little more time to collect some stories from other mothers, but that I also sort of stumbled upon another topic for this week's episode. And really what happened was I started to look into postpartum care and traditional postpartum care in many places around the world. And I found that there was a real large difference between sort of what happens in this country and what happens traditionally in many other places in the world. And the real difference that I saw was this idea of care for the mother, this idea of really acknowledging the nature of the experience, and one in which not only has a new baby been born, but so has a new mother, and really sort of understanding what that means in more traditional practices, and how us having lost a lot of that in our sort of modern Western tradition, so much of that care for the mother has gone to the wayside. And so I sort of spoke last week about the medical aspect and how so much neglect goes there. But I think it goes even further in a societal sense. And so I really just kind of wanted to take some time and talk about some of the things that I discovered and looking into how it's done in other places, and really maybe some work that we need to do in the US as a society as a whole. And so it kind of occurred to me some of the other traditions that I had seen. And so when I was in my early to mid 20s, I spent 5 years living in Tokyo. And I remember briefly hearing of a practice that goes on traditionally in Japan, and really to this day. And at the time, having never had a baby and really sort of understanding it with any depth whatsoever, sort of thought it strange. And in retrospect, I now am like, well, that's actually a really wonderful idea. And so very often in Japanese culture, after a woman gives birth, and even sometime in the period up before until she gives birth, depending on the family, many women return to their parental home. And for a anywhere between 8 to 12 week period after the baby's born, they're cared for by their mother and the other sort of relatives that are still in the parental home. And she's basically given periods to rest. Certain nutritive foods are given, and the burden of care for the newborn is sort of absorbed by the whole family. And I remember wives of friends and acquaintances that I knew sort of participating in this while I was living in Japan. And at the time, it seemed so odd to my Western sensibilities. It seemed so odd to me that, okay, you just had a baby and you're leaving your husband in Tokyo, going to sort of whatever far-flung hometown you come from, and he's not present in this really sort of what I thought important bonding time. And really, it was just very jarring to me. And I said, well, why would anybody want to do that? Isn't this, when you're meant to be a family and you're meant to sort of, bond as parents and do all these kinds of things. And I look at it now and I realize this idea of a network of support is really something that we tend to lack. And I really started to look at some of these traditions in a very different lens now that I am a mother, and now that I've sort of gone through the experience that I have over the course of the last almost 9 months, or almost 10 months now, since my daughter was born. And so I started to notice that across the world, you saw these traditions. And so I had been familiarized with the Japanese one and looked at it and said, okay, well, that's interesting. And sort of more research led me to look at customs that they observe as well in China. And it's a similar type of thing where women are cared for by female relatives, and mostly mothers and grandmothers, as many family homes are still to this day multi-generational. So for many people, it doesn't actually involve sort of even leaving the home. It's something that's already kind of in place as a support system. And generally for a 30-day period, women are encouraged to rest and discouraged from housework and discouraged from strenuous activity while the body heals. There is also an interesting use of traditional herbs and medicine that are involved in sort of healing. There's often also binding of the abdomen, which, has been proven in both Eastern and Western medicine as really sort of helpful to the healing of the body, the healing of the uterus, and all other sort of functions of the reproductive system. And so that even, this most ancient of medicine recognized the need for fortification of the body, the need for rest, the need for support, and all of these things. And so I started to notice that this was kind of a pattern across the world's more ancient of cultures, the oldest of the old world as it be. And so I kind of looked at what goes on in India as well, and I found really similar practices, in that there are sometimes not only the female relatives, but in more modern times, women and nurses who are hired, similar to, I suppose, our use of a postpartum doula that comes. A lot of Ayurvedic medicine is used, and so mothers are given different herb, both to ingest and baths to take. Babies as well, they report the use of ginger and other things rubbed on the abdomen to strengthen muscle, to encourage uterine contraction, and just this, once again, this promotion of rest, the promotion of a kind of period of birthing the mother gently into a strenuous role. And so I found it just really interesting that you kind of saw again and again across the globe this idea of a period of mothering the mother, of caring for the mother, of understanding that the rest was therapeutic, that the help was beneficial, that the imparting of wisdom that comes with experience. And so the idea that generation upon generation of women have birthed and raised children and gathered, wisdom century upon century, and that in each instance where this intergenerational contact happens, that wisdom is imparted, and piece by piece, the new mother is born and the baby is cared for, and it all sort of happens naturally together. And so I also had heard of traditions that are followed across many countries in Latin America and Central America, with something called the cuarentena, or a 40-day period after the baby is born, that the mother is often what they call sort of secluded, and so that you don't really leave the house. Once again, strenuous activity is discouraged. There's a kind of belief in keeping germs and sort of other foreign outside influences from the baby. There are spiritual aspects to it as well, and so you hear the idea of certain charms and talismans being used, but still this sense of a period of rest and healing is sort of mandated under this tradition. And so normally in that tradition, the 40-day period is culminated in a sort of ritual cleansing bath that is made of a mixture of herbs and different flowers. And I suppose depending on the country and region, it's got different elements to it. I read about the Hopi tribe in the American Southwest, where mothers spend a 22-day period of rest, and they are tended to by the elder tribeswomen who bake a specific kind of bread, and it is a sort of ancient recipe that only certain people know how to make, the elder women of the tribe. And it is considered a sort of rite of passage that when one becomes a mother, they are now sort of eligible to eat this and to participate in this rite of passage. And so it's this idea that as the baby is born, so is the mother, and welcoming the mother into this experience with sort of a gentle and wise hand that's meant to sort of guide and, allow the mother herself to blossom fully into this role. And so I sort of continued this research, and it was just really fascinating along the way as it looked from, one continent to another and one tradition to another, that there's such symmetry and similarity in the idea of what this period should look like. Even went on to read about traditions in the Ivory Coast, in West Africa, where right after the birth, the sort of female relatives in the family come, and mothers and grandmothers and aunts and cousins, and sort of all experienced women who've gone through the same thing, descend upon the house of the mother. So some of us Westerners, this sounds a bit jarring and not what you'd want right after giving birth, but it's a different perspective, And so apparently, all of the relatives descend upon the house, and a woman is given a ritual bath and massage by her own mother if she's not present. An aunt or another elder relative fills the role. And while this is happening, The baby is also given a ceremonial bath and fed, and the mother nurses the baby, and the baby's fed. And the rest of the women sort of cook a traditional meal for the woman, and they gather in a circle. Everyone eats, and after they eat, the mother's placed in the center with the baby, and they are told to nap. And they nap in this protective circle of care. And this kind of pampering will, continue for weeks after the birth. And I just, to me, it was such a wonderful image to imagine, the strength of the family unit and the strength of all of these, cheerleaders for the mother sort of gathered around and telling the woman sleep and rest. And, we've got the rest of this. And so I just found it so fascinating once again that, across such widely different cultures from, Japan to China to India to Africa to Central and South America to all of these places that we often consider so vastly different, that they all sort of shared this idea about mothering the mother, about caring for this birthing person that just, went through a life-changing and sometimes traumatic experience. And I looked at that in contrast to what we do in this country, in contrast to the way that medicalized birth, that hospitalization, and all of these things that we sort of associated with this natural process have rendered impossible. And so I really thought about my own experience and it being different than many because it involved a emergency surgery and it involved, being in the hospital, going home without the infant, all these sort of different circumstances that made it sort of impossible for any of these things to occur. But in general, even when you have a sort of quote unquote textbook birth in this country, none of this really happens and none of this is really celebrated. And I think part of it is that many people would look at so much involvement by family or so much involvement by those sort of outside the immediate circle would be looked at as a kind of loss of agency, right? And saying that I got this, I can do this myself, and, I'll be fine, and I don't need all this help, and, this is my baby and me. And not that that's not valid, but I think it really sort of lacks the circumspection that there's something to be found in ancient wisdom. There's something to be found in a collective of people who've done this before, right? And that it's really such a wonderful opportunity to be able to embrace community. And so I found myself just thinking about some of the things that I discussed last week and finding myself in this state of postpartum with so many questions and so few resources to turn to, and really just imagining, how different it would be if we sort of, as a community, embraced the fact that the mother herself does need some care and that the mother herself would benefit from a system and a society that encouraged this period to be one of rest and learning and adjusting, and really one that sort of embraced that as being necessary. And so what was interesting was I read some studies about the not only sort of emotional and physical benefits of these kinds of traditions, but also the psychological ones. And many studies reported that women who were able to participate in these kind of more traditional moments and traditional methods of postpartum care, by and large, exhibited much, much lower occurrences of postpartum depression and anxiety, and reported sort of much more thorough physical healing and less reoccurrence of post-birth physical trauma. And that so all around, it was sort of agreed upon and proven that everyone benefits from this kind of support, and that everyone benefits from understanding that there needs to be a greater support system. And so I think it exists on many different levels, because when you look at postpartum statistics that say that 1 in 4 women in this country returns to work 10 days postpartum, and that, something like 60% of the workforce isn't eligible for any kind of paid leave, that we are a country where even paternity leave and the paternal participation is just almost completely ignored. There's so many sort of systemic aspects that are working against there even being a possibility for a support network for women to have. Needless to say that in the reality of COVID and in the reality of what's gone on for women giving birth over the past year, it's gotten infinitely worse. I mean, I remember right after my daughter was born, so she was born in March in 2020, and so the day that most things locked down, weeks later, we were still in the NICU. We were there for 109 days, but I remember people talking about friends of theirs who were facing having no partner in the room when they were given birth, and women just literally birthing alone in hospitals, and women who had worked with doulas and birthing coaches and all kinds of support networks, and all of those people and all of that support sort of just being banned, and there being no exceptions and no recognition of just how awful it was to completely isolate someone in one of the most sort of vulnerable moments of their life. And so I think not only was this a situation where it had been really difficult for women in this country to begin with, but the reality of our current times have made this experience all the more isolating, so that not having birthing partners, not having someone with you, to come home and not be able to have parents and grandparents present, to not be able to have extended family travel, for there to be restrictions and quarantines and all this sort of things, that I think women have arrived in a bit of crisis with regards to any kind of postpartum support. And so I think, especially in this new paradigm that we find ourselves, we really have to navigate and figure out how we can make the best of these kinds of situations, but how we can really look at how important it is to mother the mother, how important it is to recognize the transformation that a woman sort of goes through at this time, and give her the support that she really needs, not only sort of physically, but emotionally and mentally and even spiritually. And so I think it's just something that we have to look at how we can do for each other and how we can do for the women around us. Thank you for joining us again for this episode. I appreciate the feedback that as a listener you can give me, and questions and comments are always welcomed. We can be found at our website at all the unexpected, one word, alltheunexpected.com, and on social media at both Instagram and Facebook, All the Unexpected. My professional page on LinkedIn is under Kimberly Reyes, and the podcast is available on all platforms where you find your podcasts. Thank you and have a great week.